2 in the morning, in a cold ICU room, a man in a wrinkled dress shirt knelt beside the hospital bed of the city's most powerful CEO. He gripped her motionless hand and whispered the confession he had never dared to speak in 3 years. "I love you." No one knew if she could hear him. No one knew if she would wake up. But the most terrifying thing was not death. It was the possibility that if she did wake up, would she accept love from the man who had always stood behind her for 3 years? 3 days before the accident, Derek Callahan woke at 5:30 in the morning to the sound of his daughter climbing onto his bed. Rosie was 7 years old, gap-toothed, with tangled brown hair that refused to stay in any ponytail he attempted. She pressed her cold feet against his shin and whispered that she had a nightmare about dinosaurs eating her science project. Derek pulled her close and told her the dinosaurs were vegetarians. She fell back asleep within minutes. He did not. By 6:15, he was in the kitchen frying eggs, while Rosie sat at the table with her homework spread out like a war map. She was building a model of the solar system using foam balls and wire hangers, and she had already glued Saturn's rings on upside down. Derek did not correct her. He had learned that mistakes were part of the process, and Rosie learned best when she discovered problems herself. He plated the eggs, added toast, and set the food in front of her without comment. She ate while explaining that Jupiter was technically a failed star, and he listened as if he had never heard it before. At 7:30, he dropped her off at school and watched her run toward the building with her backpack bouncing against her spine. She did not look back. She never did. Derek had been raising her alone since his wife died 4 years ago, and in that time, he had learned to measure love not by grand gestures, but by the small, repeating acts that built a life. Scrambled eggs, clean uniforms, bedtime stories. The architecture of devotion was made of things no one else noticed. By 8, he was at Shaw Industries riding the elevator to the 42nd floor with a tablet in one hand and Adrienne Shaw's schedule memorized in his head. He had been her executive assistant for 3 years, and in that time, he had become fluent in the silent language of her needs. She drank black coffee at 8:15, reviewed quarterly reports at 9, and took calls from the board at 10. She never ate lunch. She rarely smiled. She moved through her days with the precision of someone who had learned early that hesitation was weakness. Derek had loved her from the first week. He had not meant to. Love was not something he had planned for after his wife's death, and certainly not love for a woman who barely looked at him outside of work. But Adrienne had a way of existing that made the world feel both larger and lonelier, and Derek found himself drawn to the contradiction. She was brilliant and cold and entirely unreachable, and he had accepted his role as the man who stood behind her, invisible and essential. The morning passed in the usual rhythm. Adrienne arrived at 8:10, walked past his desk without greeting, and disappeared into her office. Derek brought her coffee at 8:15. She took it without looking up from her screen. At 9, he placed the quarterly reports on her desk. At 10, he transferred the board call to her line. At noon, he ordered her lunch, knowing she would not eat it. At 3, he rescheduled a meeting she had forgotten. At 5, he reminded her of a dinner with investors. She nodded. He left. This was the shape of their relationship. Professional. Distant. Built on the understanding that Derek's job was to anticipate her needs before she articulated them, and Adrienne's job was to pretend she did not need anyone at all. It had worked for 3 years. Derek had never once stepped outside the boundaries of his role. He had never said her first name aloud in her presence. He had never asked her a personal question. He had never touched her, except to hand her documents across the desk. But that evening, something shifted. At 7, when most of the office had emptied, and the cleaning crew was vacuuming the hallways, Adrienne appeared in the doorway of Derek's small workspace. She looked exhausted, in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. Her jacket was off her hair, slightly loosened from its usual tight knot, and there was a thinness to her expression that Derek had never seen before. She said his name. Just his name. Derek looked up from his computer, surprised, and she asked if he could drive her home. Her driver had called in sick, and she did not feel like taking a cab. Derek said yes before his brain could process the request. He gathered his things, turned off his computer, and followed her to the parking garage where his 10-year-old sedan sat between two luxury cars that cost more than his annual salary. Adrienne did not comment on the car. She slid into the passenger seat, fastened her seatbelt, and stared out the window as Derek navigated out of the garage and onto the street. The city lights blurred past them, reflecting off the glass towers that lined the avenue. For the first 5 minutes, neither of them spoke. Derek kept his eyes on the road, and his hand steady on the wheel, aware of her presence, in a way that felt almost physical. Then Adrienne asked him a question. She asked how he managed it, how he balanced being a single father and working the hours he did, how he stayed so calm when everything around him demanded urgency, how he managed to put other people first without losing himself in the process. Derek did not answer immediately. He changed lanes, signaled merged into traffic. He thought about Rosie asleep in her bed, about the eggs he would fry in the morning, about the 3 years he had spent loving a woman who did not know he existed outside of his function. He thought about his wife, about the way grief had taught him that love was not about possession, but about presence. He thought about all the things he could not say. Finally, he told her the truth, or at least a version of it. He said that putting other people first was not about losing himself. It was about understanding that his value was not measured by what he kept, but by what he gave. He said that being a father had taught him that love was not a transaction. It was a choice made every day in small, invisible ways. He said that balance was a myth, and what mattered was showing up even when it was hard. Adrienne listened without interrupting. When he finished, she turned to look at him for the first time since they had gotten in the car. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something softer in her eyes, something that looked almost like recognition. She said she had never thought about it that way. She said she had spent her entire life believing that vulnerability was failure. She said she was tired. Derek did not know what to say to that. He kept driving, feeling the space between them shrink in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time in 3 years, Adrienne Shaw was not his boss. She was just a woman sitting in his car, admitting that she was tired. And Derek was not just her assistant. He was a man who had learned to carry love quietly, who had built a life around the idea that some things were worth protecting, even if they would never belong to him. They were 2 blocks from her apartment when the truck ran the red light. Derek saw it half a second before impact, a flash of metal and headlights coming from the right side. His brain processed the trajectory, calculated the angle, understood that the truck would hit the passenger side first. He did not think. He turned the wheel hard to the left, throwing his body between the collision and Adrienne, and the world exploded into noise and glass and darkness. The impact threw them sideways. The airbags deployed. Metal screamed against metal. Derek felt his ribs crack, felt his head slam against something hard, felt the world tilt and spin and then go still. He could not see. He could not breathe. But he could hear Adrienne's voice faint and far away calling his name. He wanted to answer. He wanted to tell her he was fine. He wanted to ask if she was hurt. But the darkness pulled him under before he could speak, and the last thing he thought before he lost consciousness was that he had made the right choice. He had turned the wheel. He had put himself between her and the impact. And if that was the last thing he ever did, it would be enough. When he woke, he was in a hospital bed with a fractured rib, a concussion, and a daughter asleep in the chair beside him. Rosie's face was streaked with dried tears, and her hand was wrapped around his. A nurse told him he had been unconscious for 6 hours. A doctor told him he was lucky. A police officer told him the other driver had been drunk, and that Derek's quick reflexes had likely saved both their lives. But no one told him about Adrienne. No one mentioned her name. And when Derek finally found the strength to ask, the nurse's expression shifted into something careful and sad. She told him that Adrienne Shaw was in the ICU. She told him that Adrienne had not woken up. She told him that the doctors were not sure if she ever would. Derek closed his eyes and felt the weight of it settle into his chest. He had saved her life, but he might have lost her anyway. And the worst part was that she would never know. She would never know that he had turned the wheel. She would never know that he had chosen her. She would never know that for 3 years he had loved her in silence, and that in the single most important moment of his life, he had proven it in the only way that mattered. Derek was discharged from the hospital 3 days after the accident, with instructions to rest and a prescription for pain medication he did not intend to take. Rosie held his hand as they walked to the car, her grip tight enough to hurt his bruised fingers, but he did not pull away. She had been terrified, and fear in children left marks that took longer to heal than broken ribs. On the drive home, she asked if Miss Shaw was going to die. Derek told her he did not know. Rosie asked if it was his fault. Derek said no, but the lie tasted bitter in his mouth. That night after Rosie fell asleep, Derek stood in his kitchen and stared at the phone number the hospital had given him for the ICU. He had no official right to information about Adrienne's condition. He was not family. He was not her partner. He was an employee, and employees did not get updates on patients in critical care. But the nurse who had handed him the number had looked at him with something like pity and told him to call after visiting hours if he wanted to know how she was doing. Derek called at 11. The nurse told him there was no change. Adrienne was stable but unresponsive. The doctors were running tests. Her family had been notified. Derek thanked her and hung up. He stood in the dark kitchen for a long time, feeling the weight of everything he could not control pressing against his chest. Then he made a decision. He would go to the hospital. He would sit with her. He would talk to her the way he had wanted to talk to her for 3 years, and if she could not hear him, at least he would have said it. At least he would have been honest. The next evening, after putting Rosie to bed at her friend's house, Derek drove to the hospital and took the elevator to the ICU on the 9th floor. The hallway was quiet, lit by fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above his head. A different nurse sat at the desk, younger than the one from before, and she looked up when Derek approached. He gave her Adrienne's name and said he was her assistant. The nurse checked her records, frowned, and told him that only family members were allowed in the ICU after 8. Derek did not argue. He simply asked if he could sit in the waiting room nearby. The nurse studied him for a moment, then nodded. Derek sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, watching the clock on the wall tick forward in slow mechanical increments. At 10, the nurse appeared in the doorway and gestured for him to follow. She led him down the hall to a private room. At the end, pushed the door open, and told him he had 15 minutes. Derek stepped inside and heard the door close softly behind him. Adrienne lay in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped and hummed in a steady rhythm. Her face was pale, her hair loose against the pillow, and her hands rested at her sides, motionless. Derek had never seen her like this. Even in sleep, Adrienne had always seemed alert, as if some part of her was constantly calculating and planning. But now she looked fragile, and the sight of it broke something open in Derek's chest that he had been holding closed for years. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. He did not touch her. He did not speak right away. He just looked at her and tried to reconcile the woman he knew with the woman lying in front of him. Then he began to talk. He told her about Rosie's science project, about the upside-down rings on Saturn, about the way his daughter had cried when she heard about the accident. He told her about the eggs he made every morning, about the bedtime stories, about the ordinary rhythms of a life that probably seemed small compared to the empire she had built. He told her about his wife, about the way she had died suddenly from an aneurysm, about the year of grief that followed. He told her that he had learned to live with loss by understanding that love did not end when someone left. It transformed. It became memory and habit, and the small acts of care that kept a person alive in the world even after they were gone. He told her that he had been afraid to love again, and then he had met her, and fear had not mattered anymore. Derek went back every night. He coordinated with Rosie's friend's mother, a kind woman named Margaret, who asked no questions and simply told him to take the time he needed. Each night Derek sat in the waiting room until the nurse let him in, and each night he spent 15 minutes talking to Adrienne, as if she could hear him. He told her stories. He told her about his childhood, about growing up in a small town in Ohio, about his father who worked in a factory, and his mother who taught elementary school. He told her about the first time he held Rosie, about the terror and wonder of becoming a parent. He told her about the day he interviewed for the job at Shaw Industries, about how he had been intimidated by her and impressed by her in equal measure. He told her things he had never told anyone. He told her that sometimes he felt invisible, that sometimes he wondered if his life mattered to anyone outside of Rosie. He told her that working for her had given him purpose, that watching her build something extraordinary had made him feel like he was part of something larger than himself. He told her that he admired her, that he respected her, that he had fallen in love with her without ever intending to. And on the 7th night, 2 in the morning, in the cold ICU room, Derek knelt beside her bed and said the words he had never dared to speak. He gripped her motionless hand and whispered that he loved her. He told her that he had loved her for 3 years, that he had hidden it because he knew she did not want it, that he had accepted his role because being near her was enough. He told her that turning the wheel had been instinct, that he would do it again, that saving her life was the only thing he had ever done that felt like it truly mattered. He told her that if she could hear him, she did not have to say anything. She did not have to feel the same way. She did not owe him anything. He just wanted her to know that she was loved, that she had always been loved, and that he would be there when she woke up if she wanted him to be. What Derek did not know was that Adrienne could hear everything. She was trapped in a strange half-sleep, aware, but unable to respond, listening to every word he said. At first, she had not understood who was speaking. The voice had been familiar, but out of context, like hearing a song in a place where music should not exist. Then she had recognized him. Derek, her assistant, the man who brought her coffee and rescheduled her meetings, and existed in the background of her life like furniture she had stopped noticing. But the words he spoke did not match the role she had assigned him. He was not talking about work. He was talking about his daughter, his wife, his grief, his love. And Adrienne, who had spent her entire adult life building walls around herself, felt those walls crack open. She had never let anyone close. She had learned early that attachment was weakness, that people left, that trusting someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. Her mother had been cold and critical. Her father had died when she was 12. Her brother had competed with her for everything, turning sibling rivalry into a blood sport. She had built Shaw Industries alone, without help, without partnership, without love. And now, in the dark space of her unconscious mind, Adrienne listened to Derek Callahan tell her that she was loved. She listened to him describe the ordinary details of his life with a tenderness that made her ache. She listened to him confess that he had been invisible to her, and she realized with a sharp, painful clarity that he was right. She had not seen him. She had used him. She had taken his competence for granted and never once asked him who he was beyond his function. But he had seen her. He had seen her exhaustion, her loneliness, her fear. And instead of exploiting it, he had loved her. Quietly. without expectation, without demand. And when the moment came, he had turned the wheel and put himself between her and death. Adrienne wanted to wake up. She wanted to open her eyes and tell him that she heard him, that she understood, that she was sorry. But her body would not obey. She was trapped in the darkness, listening, unable to respond, and the helplessness was worse than any boardroom battle she had ever fought. On the 10th night, Adrienne's mother and brother arrived. Derek was in the waiting room when he heard their voices in the hallway, sharp and authoritative. He recognized the tone before he saw them. Victoria Shaw was in her 60s, impeccably dressed with silver hair and the kind of beauty that had been maintained through discipline and expense. Her son Graham was 2 years older than Adrienne, tall and lean, with the same cold intelligence that ran in the family. They swept into the ICU like they owned it, and in a sense they did. Money bought access. Money bought deference. Money bought the right to make decisions. Derek stayed in the waiting room listening as they spoke to the doctors. He heard Victoria ask about Adrienne's condition, heard Graham demand a second opinion, heard them discuss her care, as if she were a business asset that needed managing. No one mentioned love. No one mentioned grief. And when the conversation ended, Derek heard Victoria say that they would be limiting visitors to immediate family only. No employees, no friends, no distractions. Derek felt the ground drop out from under him. He stood and walked to the nurse's desk, where Victoria and Graham were still standing. He introduced himself as Adrienne's assistant, and Victoria looked at him the way someone might look at a piece of lint on expensive fabric. She told him that his services were no longer needed, that the family would handle Adrienne's care, that he should return to the office and focus on keeping the company running in her absence. Derek tried to explain. He told her that he had been visiting Adrienne, that he believed she could hear him, that he wanted to be there when she woke up. Victoria cut him off. She told him that he was an employee, not family, and that his presence was inappropriate. Graham added that if Derek had concerns about his job security, he should speak to human resources. Then they turned away, dismissing him as if he had never spoken. Derek stood in the hallway and felt 3 years of quiet love harden into something colder and more desperate. He could not leave. He could not walk away knowing that Adrienne was alone with people who saw her as a legacy to protect rather than a person to love. But he had no power here. He had no claim. He was exactly what they said he was, an employee, invisible, disposable. He went back to the waiting room and sat down. He stayed there until the nurses changed shifts, until the hallways emptied, until the hospital settled into the deep quiet of early morning. Then he walked back to Adrienne's room one last time. The door was closed, but not locked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Adrienne was exactly as he had left her. Still, silent, connected to machines that kept her alive. Derek moved to the side of the bed and looked down at her, memorizing the shape of her face, the curve of her jaw, the way her hair fell across the pillow. He reached out and took her hand, feeling the coolness of her skin against his palm. He told her that he had to go. He told her that her family had arrived, that they did not want him there, that he had no right to fight them. He told her that he understood. He told her that he was sorry. He told her that he loved her, and that he would always love her, and that if she woke up and needed him, he would be there. But he could not stay. He let go of her hand. He stepped back from the bed. He turned toward the door, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing against his ribs. And then he heard it, a sound, small, barely audible. He turned back. Adrienne's fingers had moved, just slightly, just enough. And in the darkness behind her closed eyes, Adrienne screamed his name, willing herself to wake up, to move, to do anything that would keep him from leaving. But her body would not obey. And Derek, not seeing the movement in the dim light, walked out of the room and closed the door behind him. Derek made it to the elevator before he stopped. His hand was on the button, his ribs aching from the walk, his mind already calculating how he would explain this to Rosie. But something held him in place. Not hope, not logic. Just the stubborn, irrational certainty that leaving now would be the worst mistake of his life. He had already made the choice once in the half-second before the truck hit, when he turned the wheel and put himself between Adrian and the impact. Walking away now would undo that choice. It would mean that saving her life had been reflex rather than love, obligation rather than devotion. Derek turned around and walked back down the hallway. The nurse at the desk looked up in surprise as he passed, but she did not stop him. He pushed open the door to Adrienne's room and stepped inside, and what he saw made him freeze. Adrienne's eyes were open. She was staring at the ceiling, her breathing shallow and quick, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. The machines around her beeped faster, registering the change, and Derek crossed the room in 3 strides. He said her name. Adrienne's eyes moved toward him slowly, as if the effort cost her everything. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Derek reached for the call button, his hand shaking, but Adrienne's fingers closed around his wrist. The grip was weak, but it was unmistakable. She was trying to tell him something. She was trying to keep him there. Derek sat down on the edge of the bed and took her hand in both of his. He told her not to try to talk, that the doctors were coming, that she was going to be fine. But Adrienne shook her head, the movement small and labored. Her mouth shaped words that did not make sound, and Derek leaned closer, trying to understand. Finally, in a voice that was barely a whisper, Adrienne said 3 words. She said, "I heard you." Derek went still. The world narrowed to the sound of her breathing, the faint pressure of her hand in his, the way her eyes held his with an intensity that felt like falling. He asked her what she meant, even though he already knew. Adrienne's fingers tightened around his, and she repeated it. "I heard you. All of it." The doctors arrived moments later, followed by nurses who moved Derek aside and began checking Adrienne's vitals. Derek stood against the wall, his heart pounding as they asked her questions and shone lights in her eyes and adjusted the machines. Adrienne answered in short, halting sentences, her gaze never leaving Derek's face. When the doctors finally stepped back, satisfied that she was stable, one of them told Derek he would need to leave so Adrienne could rest. Derek nodded and started toward the door. Adrienne said his name. The doctor turned, surprised, and Adrienne repeated it louder this time. She told them that Derek stayed. The doctor hesitated, then looked at Derek and said he could have 5 minutes. The door closed behind them and Derek and Adrienne were alone again. Adrienne spoke first. She told him she was sorry. Derek started to protest, but she cut him off with a shake of her head. She said she was sorry for not seeing him, for treating him like he was invisible, for taking 3 years of his life and never once asking what he needed. She said she had heard every word he spoke to her in the dark, every story, every confession, every moment of honesty. She said she had been awake inside her own body, screaming for him to stay, unable to move or speak or do anything except listen. Derek sat down beside her and told her she had nothing to apologize for. He told her that he had chosen his role, that he had loved her, knowing she might never love him back, that he had made peace with it. But Adrienne shook her head again. She said he deserved more than peace. He deserved to be seen. And she had failed him. Then she told him about her childhood. She told him about her father's death, about the way her mother had responded by becoming harder and colder, as if emotion were a weakness that had killed him. She told him about Graham, about the way they had been pitted against each other from the time they were children, taught that love was a competition and vulnerability was failure. She told him that she had built Shaw Industries as a fortress, a place where she could be powerful enough that no one could hurt her. She told him that she had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be anything else. And then she told him that listening to him talk about Rosie about scrambled eggs and science projects and bedtime stories had broken something open inside her. She told him that she had spent 10 days in the darkness, hearing him describe a life built on love and care and small, repeating acts of devotion, and she had realized that she had been wrong. Success was not a substitute for connection. Power was not a substitute for family. And the empire she had built was nothing compared to the life Derek had created for his daughter. Derek listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her that her life was not a failure. He told her that she had built something extraordinary, that she had created jobs and opportunities and changed industries. He told her that strength was not the same as coldness, and that she did not have to choose between power and love. He told her that he had fallen in love with her because she was brilliant and fierce and uncompromising, and he would not want her to be anyone other than who she was. Adrienne looked at him for a long moment, her eyes bright with tears she would not let fall. Then she asked him if the offer was still open. Derek asked what she meant. Adrienne said that he had told her he would be there when she woke up if she wanted him to be. She was awake now, and she wanted him to stay. Before Derek could answer, the door opened, and Victoria Shaw walked in, followed by Graham. They stopped when they saw Derek, and Victoria's expression hardened. She told Derek that she had made it clear he was not welcome, that family visiting hours were restricted, that he needed to leave immediately. Graham added that if Derek did not comply, they would have security remove him. Adrienne's voice cut through the room like a blade. She told them to get out. Victoria turned to her daughter, shocked, and Adrienne repeated it. She said that Derek was staying, and they were leaving, and if they had a problem with that, they could take it up with her lawyers. Victoria started to argue, but Adrienne cut her off. She said that for 38 years, she had let her family dictate how she lived, who she trusted, what she valued. She said she was done. She said that Derek had been more family to her in 10 days than they had been in a lifetime, and if they could not accept that, they were welcome to leave and not come back. The room went silent. Graham looked like he wanted to argue, but Victoria placed a hand on his arm and shook her head. She told Adrienne that they would discuss this later when she was feeling better, when she was thinking clearly. Adrienne told her there was nothing to discuss. Then she turned her head away, a clear dismissal, and after a long, tense moment, Victoria and Graham walked out. Derek stood frozen, unsure of what to do or say. Adrienne reached for his hand again, and he took it. She told him she meant what she said. She told him she was tired of being alone. She told him that if he was willing to give her a chance, she wanted to try. She wanted to learn how to be the kind of person who made scrambled eggs and asked about science projects and showed up every day even when it was hard. Derek told her that she did not have to change. He told her that he loved her exactly as she was, sharp edges and all. But Adrienne shook her head. She said she wanted to change, not because he asked her to, but because she had spent 10 days listening to him describe a life she had never imagined, and she wanted to know what that felt like. She wanted to know what it felt like to belong to something smaller and truer than an empire. 2 weeks later, Adrienne was discharged from the hospital. Derek picked her up in his 10-year-old sedan, the same car that had been totaled in the accident, and replaced with a similar sedan. Rosie sat in the back seat, quiet and wide-eyed, clutching a drawing she had made of the three of them standing in front of a house. Adrienne looked at the drawing, and something in her expression softened. She told Rosie it was beautiful. Rosie asked if Adrienne was going to live with them now. Adrienne looked at Derek, and Derek looked back, and the answer was in the silence between them. The first morning, Adrienne woke to the sound of Derek moving around the kitchen. She came downstairs in borrowed clothes, her hair loose, her feet bare, and found him at the stove frying eggs. Rosie was at the table working on her homework, and she looked up when Adrienne entered. She asked if Adrienne wanted to help with the new science project. Adrienne said yes, even though she had no idea what she was doing, and Rosie handed her a glue stick and a stack of construction paper. Derek set a plate of eggs in front of Adrienne and told her that breakfast was the most important meal of the day. Adrienne looked at the plate, then at Derek, then at Rosie, and felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was happiness. Simple, uncomplicated happiness built on scrambled eggs and construction paper and the ordinary rhythms of a life she had never thought she wanted. She picked up her fork and took a bite. The eggs were slightly overcooked, but she did not say anything. She just ate and listened to Rosie explain the water cycle and watched Derek move around the kitchen with the easy competence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. And she thought about the ICU room, about the darkness, about the sound of Derek's voice, telling her she was loved. She thought about the choice he had made, turning the wheel, putting himself between her and death. She thought about the 3 years he had spent loving her in silence, and the 10 days she had spent listening, and the moment she had opened her eyes and seen him standing there. And she knew with the kind of certainty that had built her empire that this was the right choice. Not because it was easy, not because it made sense, but because love, real love, was not about power or position or proving anything to anyone. It was about showing up. It was about staying. It was about the person who stood behind you when you were strong and the person who stood beside you when you were not. Derek sat down across from her with his own plate, and Rosie launched into a story about dinosaurs. Adrienne listened and ate and felt the last of her walls come down. She had spent her whole life afraid of this, afraid of needing someone, afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of giving someone the power to hurt her. But sitting in Derek's small kitchen, eating overcooked eggs, and listening to a 7-year-old talk about the Jurassic period, Adrienne realized that she had been afraid of the wrong thing. The most terrifying thing wasn't death. It was not loss. It was the possibility of living an entire life without ever knowing what it felt like to be loved like this. Quietly. Steadily. Without conditions or expectations. And Derek Callahan, the man who had been invisible to her for 3 years, had loved her exactly that way. He had seen her at her worst and chosen to stay. He had turned the wheel and saved her life. And now in the small, ordinary moments of breakfast and homework and Sunday mornings, he was teaching her how to live. Adrienne reached across the table and took his hand. Derek looked up surprised, and she told him thank you. He asked what for. She said everything. For the eggs, for the stories, for staying, for loving her even when she did not deserve it. Derek told her she had always deserved it. Adrienne said she was starting to believe him. Rosie asked if they were going to be mushy all the time now. Derek laughed, and Adrienne smiled, and the sound of it felt like coming home.